Object-oriented programming languages wouldn't be very powerful if we couldn't create our own objects and data types. While we could write applications that use strings and numbers and dates and arrays, we would have an easier time of creating applications if we could create our own objects and data types. So in this lesson, we are going to look at how we can do that with JavaScript. In the Try It section, we write a person data type so that we can create person objects to represent individual people. But before we do that, let's just create a single object. We're not going to create a data type just now. We're just going to create an object to represent a person, either me or you. So if you're following along writing code, feel free to input your own name so that we can actually see this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called person, and it is going to be an object. Now we are using the old way of creating an object here, and that's using the object constructor with the new keyword. Doing it this way is actually a lot more typing because we have to specify person, and then if we wanted a first name property, we would have to specify person.firstname, and then we would have to do the same thing for the last name property. So we actually end up typing a lot, and it takes a lot of time. So instead, what we want to do is use an object literal. It does the same thing as create an object, but we don't have to create the object using the object constructor. And since we are using object literal notation, there is slightly different operators that we use. So the first thing that we want to specify within these curly braces is the first name property. And so we are just going to type first name. Now we need to assign it a value. Well, whenever we are using object literal notation, we don't use an equal sign. Instead, we use a colon. So you can think of a colon as an equal sign. And I'm going to put my name here. Now we need a second property called last name. And so we need to put a comma at the end of this little mini statement here so that JavaScript will know that we want another property here, because if this is omitted and if we type last name and then McPeak, this is actually a syntax error because JavaScript doesn't know where the first property ends and where the second one begins. So with a comma, we separate the two, but the last one doesn't have to have a comma. In fact, if we put a comma there, some browsers would generate an error. So we always want to make sure that the last item, be it a property or a method, does not have a comma. We're going to leave this comma here because we want to create a method, and we are going to call this method get full name. And once again, we use the colon, and then we specify a function. And this function is not going to accept any arguments for data. We are going to use the properties that we have here. So we want to return a value, and we are going to use this .firstName plus a space plus this last name. Now, this variable refers to this particular object here. It's one of those keywords that means exactly what the word is. This refers to this object. It is a keyword, and it is a special variable that we can use to reference this current object here. So since getFullName is a method of this person object, this refers to this person object. So we use this to get the first name property and then the last name property. So that's how we access these two properties within this object. Now I am using string concatenation here just because we are using or joining three strings together. It's really not worth using an array and then using the join method of the array. So we have a simple person object, and we could alert, and then we could call person get full name, and we could execute that, and then this would actually return a string that has first name and then a space and then a last name. So this is a great way to represent data if we don't need other objects of this particular type. Since a person is something that we may want to use over and over and over again, it's really not feasible to create a person object like this, because we would then have to copy this code, paste it again, change the variable name here, and then modify these properties. And that's just a lot of extra code and a lot of extra work that we don't want to do. So instead, we are going to create a person data type so that we could call the constructor with the new keyword and then create an object. So this is where we are going to pick up with the try it section. So the first thing we need to do is write a constructor function to create person objects from. So I'm going to create a function, call it person. It's going to accept two pieces of data, a first name and a last name, so that whenever we call the constructor function, we will pass the first name and last name for the person that we want to represent in our code. Now notice the name of this function is using an uppercase letter as its first character. This is a convention that professional developers follow. Whenever we create a data type, we capitalize the first letter of the constructor function. This is so that whenever we are looking through code, we can easily identify those functions that are used to create objects. If we had just used a lowercase character as we have done here, this blends in with all the other types of functions. So if we were looking at this, this could return a value, this could do something with the first name and last name, we just really don't know. But since it has a capital P, we know for sure that this function is going to create a person object. So let's give our person objects two properties, a first name and a last name property, and we'll use the values passed to these parameters. So we will use the this variable, and our first property will be called first name, and we will assign it the value of the first name parameter. Then we'll create a last name property, and we will use the last name parameter. Now once again, this variable points to the object that we are creating with this person constructor. So whenever we call this constructor with the new keyword, then this will point to the object that we are creating. So now let's create the get full name function. It's going to do the same thing as it did before, but we just specify it within our constructor function. So we do function, and then we return this first name, and then this last name. So everything is the same. Notice that we are using assignment operator because we are not using object literal notation no longer. We are actually writing within a function, so we can use the assignment operators that we have done here. Now let's also add another method called greet, and this method will be used so that we could greet other person objects. So we'll use the this keyword and then greet equals function. This is going to accept a person object, and inside of it we want to call alert, and then we'll say hello, and then we'll use the person that we passed into it, and we will use the get full name method. So now we have a simple person constructor that we can call anytime that we want to create a person within our code. And let's do that right now. We'll create a variable called person1. We will say new person, and then we will pass in my first name and my last name. So we have created a person object. Its first name will be Jeremy. Its last name will be McPeak. And then we have these methods that will execute and use the first name and last name properties for get full name. And then we use a second person here for the greet. So let's create another person object. We're going to call this person John Doe. And let's call person1 greet person2. So person1 is going to greet person2, and it's going to say hello person2, which will be hello John Doe. So let's see this in action. Let's load it into our browser, and we will see an alert box that says hello John Doe. Perfect. Everything is running just fine. Now let's reverse these two so that John Doe says hi to me. So whenever we refresh the page again, it'll say, hello, Jeremy McPeak. So we have created a data type, a custom data type, one that we can use within our own applications to represent an individual person. Now, we couldn't do that with any other built-in data types like strings or numbers or anything. Now, we have used strings here, but we have used them to create a more complex piece of data. So we have this person object, and we will actually use this in lesson 9 to create an employee object. So stay tuned for that.